Welcome to the History AI Podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Welcome back to the History AI Podcast. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco.
Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star review. That 5-star review really does help the show grow, reach new listeners, and continue bringing history to people who enjoy learning about the past without having to sit through a 3-hour university lecture delivered by a man who refuses to use a microphone.
Or a professor who says, "This will not be on the exam," and then builds the entire exam around it.
A 5-star review protects you from that kind of betrayal.
Probably. We have not tested that scientifically.
You can also suggest future episode topics through our social media pages. We read those suggestions, and many of our episodes begin with an idea sent in by a listener.
We also have new History AI podcast merchandise available. You'll find the link in the show notes. It is perfect for history fans, podcast listeners, and anyone who wants strangers at the grocery store to know that they have strong opinions about the Congress of Vienna.
And remember, all our episodes are evergreen. They are designed to remain relevant over time, so you can listen today, next month, or several years from now.
Unless someone invents time travel and personally changes the events we're discussing.
In that case, Marco and I will release a correction.
Assuming we still exist.
Today's episode takes us to Britain during the Second World War and to a bombing campaign whose name sounds strangely harmless, the Baedeker Blitz. And be sure to stay tuned after the episode for the original song, the Baedeker Blitz.
It sounds like a frantic vacation. You have 3 days, 6 cities, and a very aggressive tour guide.
Unfortunately, the reality was far darker. Beginning in April 1942, the German Luftwaffe attacked a series of historic English cities. These were places known for medieval streets, cathedrals, Georgian architecture, ancient walls, universities, guild halls, and centuries of cultural memory.
Exeter, Bath, Norwich, York, and Canterbury became the principal targets.
The raids were presented as retaliation for British attacks on historic German cities. Their purpose was not simply to damage military production. They were also intended to wound British morale by destroying places that symbolized the country's history and identity.
This was bombing aimed not only at buildings and people, but at memory.
And the name Baedeker came from something that, before the war, had been associated with peaceful travel, a guidebook.
So how did a respected travel guide become attached to a campaign of destruction?
To answer that, we need to begin with the changing air war over Europe in early 1942. By the spring of 1942, Britain had already endured the main phase of the Blitz. From September 1940 into 1941, German bombers had attacked London and many other British cities, including Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Plymouth, Bristol, Glasgow, Belfast, Hull, and Portsmouth.
The Luftwaffe's campaign had inflicted enormous damage and killed tens of thousands of civilians, but it had failed to break British resistance, destroy the Royal Air Force, or force Britain out of the war.
Then the strategic situation changed. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. More German aircraft and resources were required elsewhere. Britain remained under attack, but the enormous sustained bombing campaign of 1940 and 1941 had declined.
Meanwhile, Britain was developing its own bombing offensive against Germany.
British bombing policy had evolved through a difficult combination of strategic theory, technological limitation, military pressure, and retaliation. Early in the war, leaders had hoped that bombers could strike specific industrial and military targets with precision.
But nighttime navigation was unreliable, weather interfered, targets were difficult to identify, and bombs frequently landed far from their intended destinations.
The phrase precision bombing sounds wonderfully controlled. In practice, especially at night in the early 1940s, it often meant that a crew was trying to find one particular industrial complex while flying through darkness, clouds, anti-aircraft fire, searchlights, and enemy fighters.
Using navigation equipment that would make a modern delivery driver declare the package undeliverable.
British planners increasingly turned toward area bombing, attacking large urban zones that contained factories, rail lines, workers' housing, transport networks, and other elements of the German war economy.
In February 1942, Air Marshal Arthur Harris became Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command. Harris believed that a massive bombing offensive against German cities could cripple industrial production, shatter morale, and contribute decisively to victory.
That belief would lead to some of the most destructive and morally controversial operations of the war.
One early target under the developing campaign was Lübeck.
Lübeck was an ancient port city in northern Germany. It had been a major center of the Hanseatic League and possessed a historic core filled with medieval buildings.
It also had military and industrial significance, but its old city was especially vulnerable to fire. Many structures were built closely together, with timber incorporated into their construction.
On the night of March 28th and 29th, 1942, the Royal Air Force attacked Lübeck with high-explosive bombs and incendiaries. High explosives shattered roofs, windows, streets, and water lines. Incendiaries then ignited fires inside the damaged buildings.
The result was a destructive firestorm across parts of the city. Historic structures were damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of people were killed, and many thousands were left homeless.
The attack demonstrated that Bomber Command could devastate a German urban center. For the Nazi leadership, it was also a humiliation.
Lübeck had not been selected merely because it was beautiful, but its cultural importance made the destruction especially powerful as propaganda.
Adolf Hitler demanded retaliation. British cities of comparable historical and cultural importance would be attacked.
In other words, the logic became, you damaged one of our historic cities, so we will damage yours.
It was a cycle of retaliation in which civilians and irreplaceable buildings became the instruments.
The Nazis publicly described the coming raids as reprisals. Joseph Goebbels, Germany's propaganda minister, wanted the attacks framed as a justified answer to British bombing, rather than as an admission that Germany was deliberately targeting cultural landmarks.
Then, a German Foreign Office spokesman reportedly made the remark that would give the campaign its enduring name. He suggested that the Luftwaffe would bomb every British building awarded 3 stars in a Baedeker guide.
Baedeker guides were famous European travel books. They were compact, detailed, and authoritative. Travelers used them to find hotels, museums, monuments, churches, rail connections, and important sites.
Their star ratings highlighted attractions considered especially worthy of attention,
which meant that a statement intended as propaganda created an unforgettable image. German planners opening a tourist guide and using its recommendations as a bombing list.
There is no good evidence that Luftwaffe crews literally sat around selecting every target directly from guidebook stars.
It is a powerful image, but history is often less tidy than the nickname suggests. The targets were selected through military planning, intelligence, maps, reconnaissance, political direction, and strategic considerations.
Some of the cities also contained factories, railway facilities, ports, airfields, or other legitimate military objectives. The distinction between a purely cultural target and a strategically useful city was not always clean,
but the intention to attack historic places for their symbolic and psychological importance was real.
And the name stuck: the Baedeker raids, or the Baedeker Blitz.
The first target was Exeter.
Exeter was an ancient city in Devon, in southwestern England. Its history stretched back to Roman Britain. At its center stood Exeter Cathedral, surrounded by historic streets and buildings.
Exeter was not one of Britain's largest industrial centres. That helped make the purpose of the attack unmistakable.
The first raid came on the night of April 23rd and 24th, 1942, St. George's Day. The operation did not go entirely as planned. Navigation difficulties meant that much of the bombing was scattered.
But the Luftwaffe returned the following night. This second attack was far more destructive.
Bombs struck residential neighborhoods and other parts of the city. Fires broke out. Buildings collapsed. Civilians were killed in their homes and shelters.
The attackers returned again in early May. That raid devastated parts of Exeter's historic centre. The cathedral was damaged, and its chapel of St. James was destroyed, but the main structure survived.
Around it, much of the surrounding city burned.
There is a terrible contrast in many photographs taken after bombing raids. A cathedral tower or church spire remains standing above a landscape of roofless buildings, shattered walls, and smoking rubble.
The survival of a landmark could become a symbol of endurance. But for the families who had lost relatives, homes, businesses, and entire streets, the fact that a famous building remained standing did not erase the devastation.
That is important. Historical accounts often focus on which monuments survived. Civilians did not experience these raids as a competition between famous architecture and bombs.
They experienced darkness, noise, fire, fear, and loss.
Air raid sirens sent people toward shelters. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Searchlights crossed the sky. Aircraft engines approached overhead.
Then came the high explosives and incendiaries.
High explosive bombs could tear open buildings and crater roads. Incendiaries were designed to start large numbers of fires. Firefighters, wardens, rescue parties, police officers, medical workers, soldiers, and volunteers had to respond while the bombing continued.
And ordinary civilians became part of civil defense. They watched rooftops for incendiaries. They carried water and sand. They helped neighbors escape damaged homes. They searched through rubble.
The destruction was physical, but the experience was intensely personal. One house might be demolished while the house beside it remained almost untouched. One family might survive because they entered a shelter minutes earlier. Another might die because a doorway became blocked.
War on this scale often turns survival into a matter of terrifying chance.
After Exeter came Bath.
Bath was one of Britain's most celebrated architectural cities. It was famous for its Roman baths and for the elegant Georgian buildings constructed from honey-colored local stone.
Its crescents, terraces, squares, and assembly rooms reflected the city's fashionable 18th century past.
On the nights of April 25th and 26th, and again April 26th and 27th, German bombers attacked Bath.
These became known locally as the Bath Blitz.
Hundreds of people were killed. Many more were injured. Thousands of buildings were damaged, including homes and major architectural landmarks.
The assembly rooms, one of the city's great Georgian buildings, were badly damaged by fire.
Entire streets were struck. Houses that had stood for generations collapsed or burned.
Bath presented a challenge for civil defense, because many residents had assumed it was less likely to be attacked than a major industrial city or port.
That assumption was understandable. Bath was renowned as a spa town, an architectural treasure, but its very reputation now made it a target.
A place people might once have visited for healing, leisure, and beauty became a place attacked because of those associations.
The bombing also exposed the difficult reality of shelters. Some people survived underground or in reinforced spaces. Others were killed when shelters received direct hits or when damaged buildings collapsed over entrances.
Rescue teams worked among unstable walls, unexploded bombs, broken gas lines, and active fires.
And again, individual acts of courage became part of the city's story. Wardens remained at their posts. Fire crews fought blazes under dangerous conditions. Medical workers treated casualties while facilities were overwhelmed.
Courage during an air raid does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is a person repeatedly carrying buckets of water. Sometimes it is someone refusing to abandon an injured stranger. Sometimes it is a volunteer calmly writing down names while the building shakes.
Or someone serving tea.
That sounds like a joke about Britain, but tea genuinely became part of emergency relief. Mobile canteens and volunteers provided hot drinks and food to rescue workers and displaced residents.
Civilization sometimes survives through very small routines.
A cup, a blanket, a familiar voice, a neighbor saying, "You can stay with us."
Norwich was attacked next.
Norwich was another ancient cathedral city, with medieval churches, narrow streets, industrial sites, and densely built residential areas.
It was also home to manufacturing, including important factories. So Norwich had both symbolic and practical value as a target.
On the night of April 27th and 28th, German aircraft dropped high explosive bombs and incendiaries on the city.
Fires spread across industrial and residential districts. The Cali chocolate factory was among the sites hit and burned.
A chocolate factory sounds like the least military phrase imaginable.
During wartime, however, factories could be adapted for different forms of production, and large industrial buildings were part of a city's economic capacity.
Norwich suffered further raids, including another major attack at the end of April.
Hundreds of residents were killed over the course of the attacks on the city, and many more were injured. Homes, shops, factories, churches, and historic buildings were destroyed or damaged.
Norwich Cathedral survived, although the surrounding city suffered heavily.
The Luftwaffe's ability to strike an individual landmark at night was limited. Bombers were attacking broad urban areas, not dropping modern precision-guided weapons.
And even modern precision is never perfect. In 1942, crews navigated through darkness using a combination of instruments, radio systems, visual clues, dead reckoning, and estimates.
Some bombers missed their intended cities altogether. Others released their loads after seeing fires started by earlier aircraft.
Once a city was burning, flames could act as a beacon for the bombers following behind.
That is one reason incendiaries were so devastating. They did not simply destroy individual structures. They marked the target and created conditions for wider destruction.
The defenders adapted. Decoy sites were established outside cities, using controlled lights and fires to imitate burning urban districts and lure aircraft away.
Britain called some of these starfish sites. The idea was to reproduce the appearance of fires, railway yards, or industrial activity when seen from the air.
Essentially, civil defense planners built fake burning cities to protect real ones,
which is a grim but ingenious sentence,
and very representative of wartime problem-solving.
Then came York.
York was one of England's most historically significant cities. It had Roman origins, Viking history, medieval walls, narrow streets, guild buildings, railway infrastructure, and the enormous Gothic cathedral, York Minster.
The Luftwaffe attacked during the early hours of April 29, 1942.
The raid killed dozens of people and damaged hundreds of buildings.
York's medieval Guildhall was badly damaged. The railway station and industrial areas were also struck, demonstrating again that the city was not solely a cultural target.
York was a major railway centre, and rail transportation was essential to the British war effort.
The attack therefore combined several forms of targeting. York possessed symbolic value, transport importance, industrial activity, and a dense civilian population.
York Minster survived, though nearby areas suffered damage.
One of the most discussed stories from the raid involves the Bar Convent, a historic Catholic convent near the railway station.
A bomb struck the building, killing several people. Yet much of the convent remained standing, and survivors were rescued.
The stories of these raids are filled with such moments: survival beside death, endurance beside destruction.
And then, almost immediately, people had to begin clearing streets, identifying victims, finding temporary housing, restoring water and electricity, and deciding which damaged buildings could be saved.
The morning after a raid was not a return to normality. It was the beginning of an enormous practical and emotional task.
People went to work when possible. Shops reopened in temporary locations. Signs appeared directing customers to new entrances. Churches held services in damaged buildings or nearby halls.
That activity was sometimes celebrated as the Blitz spirit, the image of British civilians responding with humor, calm, and unity.
There was truth in it. Many people showed extraordinary resilience.
But the phrase can also smooth away the suffering. Not everyone was calm. Not everyone behaved heroically. People were frightened, angry, exhausted, traumatized, and sometimes overwhelmed.
Resilience does not mean the absence of fear. It means continuing while afraid.
After the first concentrated wave of attacks, the campaign continued.
Exeter was struck again. Norwich was attacked again. Other places, including Cowes on the Isle of Wight, also suffered raids.
Cowes contained a major shipyard, which made it an obvious military and industrial target, as well as a place with civilian neighborhoods.
Then, at the end of May, Canterbury was attacked.
Canterbury held enormous symbolic significance. It was the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury and home to Canterbury Cathedral, one of the most important religious buildings in England.
Its history was linked to St. Augustine, Thomas Becket, medieval pilgrimage, Geoffrey Chaucer, and the development of English Christianity.
It was, in other words, a city almost designed to appear in a Baedeker guide.
German bombers attacked on the night of May 31st and June 1st, 1942, as Britain launched its first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne.
The timing reinforced the cycle of attack and reprisal. As British aircraft struck a major German city, German aircraft bombed Canterbury.
Parts of Canterbury's historic centre were destroyed. Civilians were killed. The cathedral itself survived, protected in part by firefighters and volunteers who watched for incendiaries and dealt with them before they could ignite a catastrophic blaze.
That required people to remain on or near the cathedral roof during an attack.
Which is the kind of assignment that should come with more than a helmet and a bucket.
Yet across Britain, fire watchers did exactly that. They monitored factories, churches, offices, warehouses, and public buildings. When incendiaries landed, they attempted to extinguish or isolate them.
An incendiary bomb could be small enough to handle with equipment, but it burned at extremely high temperatures and could cause a building to catch fire rapidly.
Fire watchers had to act before one small fire became an uncontrollable inferno.
Canterbury suffered additional attacks later in 1942, showing that the boundaries of the Baedeker Blitz are not always defined in exactly the same way.
Some accounts focus narrowly on the principal raids of April and May. Others include related attacks extending into June or later in the year.
Historical labels are often created after events, and reality rarely organizes itself into a neat chapter with a clear opening and closing date.
So, did the Baedeker Blitz work?
That depends on what we mean by work.
It unquestionably killed civilians, injured many more, destroyed homes, damaged historic buildings, and imposed suffering on the targeted communities.
It created fear and forced Britain to devote resources to air defense, firefighting, rescue work, reconstruction, and relief.
In that sense, the raids caused real harm.
But they did not force Britain to halt its bombing offensive against Germany.
They did not break British morale.
And they did not restore Germany's strategic advantage in the air war.
The Luftwaffe's bomber strength in Western Europe was limited. Germany was fighting a vast war against the Soviet Union, conducting operations in the Mediterranean, defending occupied Europe, and supporting ground forces across multiple fronts.
Every bomber committed to attacks on British cities was an aircraft that could not be used elsewhere.
German losses also mattered. British night fighters, anti-aircraft guns, radar, searchlights, barrage balloons, and civil defense systems had improved since the opening phase of the Blitz.
The Luftwaffe could still inflict destruction, but it no longer possessed the strength to sustain a campaign on the scale of 1940.
Britain's bomber force, by contrast, was growing.
Just hours before the first major raid on Canterbury, the RAF sent more than 1,000 aircraft against Cologne.
The 1,000-bomber raid was partly a demonstration. It required pulling together aircraft and crews from training units and other commands, but it showed the scale Britain hoped to achieve.
The imbalance would grow. Allied bombing of Germany became vastly larger and more destructive as the war continued.
The Baedeker raids did nothing to reverse that trend.
If Hitler hoped to frighten Britain into reducing the bombing of German cities, the policy failed.
Instead, the attacks were absorbed into British propaganda as further evidence of Nazi brutality.
The very name, Baedeker Blitz, undermined Germany's preferred message. It suggested that the Luftwaffe was bombing beautiful places simply because they appeared in a travel guide,
which made the campaign seem vindictive rather than strategically purposeful.
Goebbels reportedly disliked the guidebook remark for precisely that reason. It revealed too much.
Propaganda is usually most effective when it conceals the ugliest part of the policy.
There is also a larger question here about the bombing of cultural heritage.
Throughout history, armies have destroyed temples, libraries, palaces, monuments, churches, mosques, archives, universities, and historic neighborhoods.
Sometimes destruction is accidental. Sometimes a military target is located near a cultural site. Sometimes a landmark is used for observation, communication, storage, or defense.
And sometimes cultural destruction is intentional.
Attacking heritage can be a way of attacking identity. A cathedral, shrine, library, or ancient city tells a community that it has a past. Destroying that place can be intended to suggest that the community has no future.
Buildings carry memory. They connect people to events that occurred long before anyone currently alive was born.
A medieval hall is not merely stone and timber. It may represent centuries of ceremonies, arguments, celebrations, judgments, markets, political meetings, and ordinary daily life.
When such a building is destroyed, the human cost of the attack remains the greatest tragedy. But something else is also lost, a physical connection across time.
And unlike a factory, which may be reconstructed to the same design and purpose, an ancient building cannot truly be replaced.
It can be rebuilt, it can be restored, but its original materials, accumulated changes, craftsmanship, and physical contact with previous generations may be gone.
This is why cultural sites receive special concern during wartime, even though protecting human life must remain the priority.
The Baedeker Blitz deliberately exploited the emotional value of historic places.
Yet, the raids also showed the limits of attempting to bomb a people into submission by attacking their past.
Instead of making the population feel detached from those places, destruction could deepen their attachment.
A damaged cathedral became a symbol of survival. A ruined guildhall became a reason to rebuild. A shattered street became part of local memory.
The attacker could destroy a building without controlling what that destruction would mean.
That does not mean every historic building was restored.
And after the war, British cities faced difficult choices. Housing was urgently needed. Money, materials, and labor were limited. Some damaged structures could be repaired. Others were unstable or considered beyond safety.
And post-war planners did not always value Victorian, Georgian, or medieval buildings in the same way preservationists might value them today.
Bombing damage sometimes became an opportunity for ambitious redevelopment.
Which is a polite way of saying, the Luftwaffe started the demolition, and the city council finished it.
Harsh, but occasionally accurate.
Roads were widened, modern shopping areas were built. Surviving structures were cleared to create new developments.
In some places, wartime destruction accelerated changes that planners had already wanted.
That complicates the story. The appearance of modern British cities is not solely the result of German bombing. It reflects bombing, emergency demolition, post-war reconstruction, economic pressure, architectural fashion, traffic planning, and political decisions.
Bath restored many of its most famous Georgian buildings, though some losses were permanent.
York's Guildhall was reconstructed after the war.
Exeter rebuilt its commercial centre, but many historic streets and buildings were gone forever.
Norwich and Canterbury also faced the challenge of combining preservation with the needs of modern urban life.
Memorials, plaques, restored buildings, preserved ruins, local archives, and family stories continue to mark the raids.
But memory is uneven. National histories tend to emphasize the Blitz on London and the destruction of Coventry.
Understandably, both were enormously significant.
Yet that focus can make the experiences of Exeter, Bath, Norwich, York, Canterbury, and many other cities seem like smaller side stories.
They were not side stories to the people who lived through them.
The Baedeker raids also challenged the simple story that one side bombed civilians, while the other side merely defended itself.
Britain was fighting a dictatorship responsible for aggression, occupation, mass murder, and genocide. Nazi Germany began the European War and had already bombed cities across Poland, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and Britain.
But recognizing the criminal nature of the Nazi regime does not remove the moral questions raised by Allied area bombing.
British attacks on German cities killed vast numbers of civilians and destroyed historic urban centers. Lübeck was only an early example.
Later raids on Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin, and many other places would produce destruction on a far greater scale than the Baedeker Blitz.
Historians continue to debate the military effectiveness, necessity, proportionality, and morality of strategic bombing.
Some emphasize its contribution to weakening German industry, transportation, oil production, air defenses, and military resources.
Others emphasize that bombing cities caused enormous civilian casualties while repeatedly failing to produce the predicted collapse in public morale.
Both sides of that debate must confront the limitations of wartime technology and the decisions made by leaders who believed they were fighting for national survival.
The Baedeker Blitz sits within that wider escalation.
First one city burns, then another city is attacked in retaliation. Each raid becomes the justification for the next.
The language of reprisal makes escalation sound almost automatic.
But it was not automatic. Human beings made decisions at every stage.
Decisions about targets.
Decisions about acceptable civilian risk.
Decisions about propaganda.
Decisions about whether destroying a city would shorten the war or merely deepen the suffering.
The people beneath the bombers had no control over those decisions.
There is another reason the Baedeker Blitz remains memorable: the strange contrast contained in its name.
A guidebook exists to help people experience a place.
It directs travelers toward things worth seeing.
A bombing plan destroys those
The guidebook
things.
says this is beautiful, Go there.
The bomber says this is valuable. Eliminate it.
Tourism and war both use maps, routes, landmarks, and descriptions of cities, but for opposite purposes.
One depends on curiosity. The other depends on targeting.
One preserves memory through experience. The other attempts to manipulate memory through destruction.
It is no wonder the phrase survived.
Even people who know little about the raids can understand the horror behind the idea of turning a cultural guide into a target directory.
But we should remember that the phrase can also oversimplify. German targeting was not literally determined by star ratings alone. Several cities contained genuine military, transportation, or industrial objectives.
History becomes less useful when a powerful nickname replaces the complicated reality.
The Baedeker Blitz was both symbolic and strategic, both retaliatory and propagandistic, both militarily limited and personally devastating.
It failed to achieve its largest strategic goals.
But calling it a failure can sound strange when more than 1,000 people were killed across the wider series of raids, and tens of thousands of buildings were damaged.
A military operation can fail strategically and still succeed in destroying countless lives.
Imagine standing in one of those cities before the war.
You might walk beneath a medieval gateway in York, past Georgian terraces in Bath, hear cathedral bells in Exeter, visit a market in Norwich, or follow the old streets toward Canterbury Cathedral.
These places would feel permanent.
That is one of the illusions created by ancient buildings. Because they existed before us, we assume they will exist after us.
Then, in a single night, a street that survived centuries can disappear.
A family home can become a pile of bricks before dawn.
A building mentioned in guidebooks can become a photograph in an archive.
Yet the history of the Baedeker Blitz is not only a history of destruction.
It is also about rescue workers entering unstable buildings,
Firefighters protecting cathedrals and neighborhoods.
nurses and doctors treating casualties,
Volunteers feeding and sheltering people who had lost everything.
families taking in strangers.
Communities deciding to rebuild.
The raids were intended to damage morale by severing people from their history.
Instead, they often made local history feel more immediate.
The old buildings were no longer simply picturesque backgrounds. They had become survivors, memorials, or absences.
And the gaps mattered as much as the structures that remained.
So, what should we remember about the Baedeker Blitz?
We should remember that it began within an escalating bombing war. The RF's destruction of Lübeck helped provoke Hitler's order for retaliation against historic British cities.
We should remember that the Baedeker name came from a propaganda remark connecting the attacks to the famous German travel guides.
We should remember the principal cities: Exeter, Bath, Norwich, York, and Canterbury.
We should remember that these places were targeted for a mixture of cultural, psychological, industrial, and strategic reasons.
We should remember that famous landmarks were not the only things at
Behind
stake.
every statistic were individuals who had names, homes, routines, families, fears, and plans for the future.
And we should remember that the effort to destroy a society's history does not necessarily destroy its will.
The Baedeker Blitz damaged buildings that had survived for centuries.
It killed civilians who had no part in choosing the targets of Bomber Command or the Luftwaffe.
It failed to halt Britain's bombing campaign.
It failed to break British resistance.
But it left permanent marks on cities, landscapes, families, and public memory.
The name remains a warning about what happens when culture itself becomes a weapon of
Before
war.
we go, we want to give special thanks to everyone listening. Whether this is your first episode or you've been with us from the beginning,
Your support makes the podcast possible. Subscribing, rating the show, and sharing an episode with someone who enjoys history all help us reach a larger audience.
please leave us a 5-star review. We genuinely appreciate it, and that 5-star review helps the podcast
You can
grow.
also send us suggestions for future topics through social media. Tell us about the event, person, mystery, battle, invention, disaster, or historical oddity you would like Chuck and me to explore.
And take a look at our new merchandise. The link is waiting for you in the show notes.
Wear it proudly while visiting a museum, reading a suspiciously large biography, or explaining to your family why their favorite historical movie is inaccurate.
Remember that every episode of the History AI podcast is evergreen. Our archive is always open, so explore an older episode, share one with a friend, or revisit a topic whenever you like.
History does not expire.
Though some historical opinions probably should.
I have several
For
candidates.
Marco, I'm Chuck.
And for Chuck, I'm Marco.
Thank you for listening to the History AI podcast.
We'll see you next time.
Came when the moon hid behind the smoke, engines droning through the midnight cold. Not for the docks, not the guns alone, but for the stories the old streets told. Cathedrals stood through 1,000 years, stone by stone through fire and rain. One little book marked them out in ink and turned their beauty into flame. Maps don't cry, they don't bleed, but every circle on that page was someone's memory. Burn the towers, break the bells, let the ancient city fall. Strike the places travelers loved, answer ruin back with all history written in the ash, echoes carried on the wind. You can level every stone, but you can't erase where we've been. Exeter burned beneath the stars, Bath awoke to shattered glass. Norwich watched its skyline fade while firefighters held a line at last. York looked upward through the haze, Canterbury felt the night. Families huddled underground, praying morning brought the light. The bombs don't know, the prayers below, they only fall where they're told to go. Burn the towers, break the bells, let the ancient city fall. Strike the places travelers loved, answer ruin back with all history written in the ash, echoes carried on the wind. You can level every stone, but you can't erase where we've been. One guidebook opened, one order given, centuries measured against revenge. The walls collapsed, the windows broke, but hope kept breathing inside the smoke. Ring the bells, though cracked with fire, raise the roofs where embers lie. Every scar becomes a story, every dawn another try. Cities live beyond the war, long after sirens fade away. You can bomb the heart of England, but you cannot bomb its faith. Now the tourists walk those streets, reading names on weathered stone. The cities that were marked for death still stand to tell their own.